Ctc is celebrating an admirable 90 years this year. 90 years filled with entrepreneurship, spirit and eventful development, all shown to you in this slideshow. Ctc was established 90 years ago, but our journey starts 137 years ago on the Swedish west coast in June 1876. That's when Colonel Radiator Tillander and Ellen Gibson, both from Gothenburg, had a son who was to become of great importance for the development of residential heating in Sweden. The son was named Gunnar, his middle name Rikard after his father, and it was Gunnar Rikard Tillander who was to found Ctc 47 years later in 1923. Gunnar proved to be a well-behaved and intelligent young pupil. At the age of 21, he graduated from the Royal Institute of Technology with a Master of Science degree in Engineering. The year was 1897, but Gunnar did not know yet what would catch his interest in the future. After studying at John Lenning's School of Weaving in Norrköping in 1898, Gunnar moved to England, where he continued his studies for another 2 years. Nobody knows for sure what subjects Gunnar undertook, but with a Swedish Master of Science, one can assume some sort of higher education was undertaken. After his return, Gunnar spent a significant amount of time with the top businessmen of Gothenburg. For example, Gunnar's brother-in-law, Knut Jison Mark, was one of the founders of SKF, the Swedish ball bearing factory, in 1907, and Volvo in 1926. Now one can only guess what was discussed during the family events. Presumably the conversations breathed entrepreneurship and initiative, combined with ideas of products and sales opportunities. In the year of 1900, aged only 24, Gunnar started his first business, Eminent AB. Gunnar sold the enterprise shortly after to a J.T. Sandberg, who were to be Gunnar's companion in many other companies in the future. During the first half of the 20th century, we can see the start of a slow improvement in the residential living conditions. The laundry practices of that time were tedious with washing, rinsing and beating. In 1902, Kalor AB is established, a company that develops and sells washing machines. This company will, in the far future, become a part of the Ctc family. Gunnar is also a chairman for Kalor during some time. In his young years, Gunnar showed great interest in domestic functionality. His first known patent is that of a new kind of fresh air valve. The finished document from 1902 with the accompanying sketch shows the construction. A similar throttle was patented 2 years later in 1904. Svenska Värmetekniska Föreningen, which is the Swedish Thermal Engineering Association, was founded in 1909. Gunnar was one of the initiators and creators. He is in the high seat on the chair in the front row. That same year, Gunnar founded Värmelednings AB Celsius and Vulkanverken AB 2 years later. Vulkanverken's main task was to own and administer real estate and assets. The company is, after 8 years, sold to Nordiska Kullager AB. In 1910, Gunnar becomes a partner in the safe manufacturer E.A. Rosengrens AB, which will later on become a part of the Ctc business concern. Along with several other investors, Gunnar launches a company, Coronaverken, in 1918. It mainly develops and manufactures washing machines. For a very long time, the company's CEO was Reinhold Hjort. Later, in 1947, Coronaverken became wholly owned by Ctc and will later on become Corona Förvaltnings AB, what was then called an umbrella company, with Ctc as the biggest constituent company. World War I dominated the world events during the 1910s, but the lengthy war is finally over in 1918. And even though Sweden was not a part of the war, the future still breathes of gumption and development. Gunnar was active in the thermal and sanitation business during the 1910s, and many of his ideas now needed industrialization. As early as December 1922, Gothenburg's finest specialists in thermal engineering gathered to lay the grounds for Ctc. The inaugural meeting took place the following spring, on May 5, 1923, which became the starting date for Tillander's Ctc. Gunnar found that quality and standardization had a positive impact on his activity, and his motto was, "Development requires constant new designs and improvements." And it's in these words that we find the explanation to Ctc's initials. Ctc, cum tentatione corrigendi, which is Latin for with the temptation to change. Or in other words, Gunnar's motto. Now, how do we know that this is the correct explanation to the initials? Not so long ago, Gunilla Gram, daughter to the first Ctc factory manager in Ljungby, contacted Ctc to donate some old Ctc photographs. Gunilla had once asked her father about the initials. The father, Helge Andrén, worked for Ctc in the 1920s, and he told her with certainty that Ctc stood for that Latin phrase. Another interesting indication is that Gunnar's brother-in-law, Knut Jison Mark, 3 years later was one of the founders to Volvo, which means "I roll" in Latin. Maybe Gunnar suggested the idea. Who knows? There is scant material left from Ctc's initial time in Gothenburg, but the activity was probably scattered between sanitary and thermal engineering. The development of Tillander's invention seems, however, to have been the main priority. Mainly, Ctc developed and manufactured valves and regulators, but the fabrication of sanitary ware also started. It was, however, one of Gunnar's inventions that turned out to mean a great deal to the company's evolution, an innovation that still today pervades Ctc's products: instantaneous and heat accumulation technology. This technology has ever since the 1920s been called the Ctc System. The basic idea behind the Ctc System was copper coils lowered into the heater's warm water, producing clean and fresh warm water. This created one single heating unit instead of a separate water heater. When Ctc was established in Ljungby in 1931 through acquiring Ljungby Metall och Armaturfabrik AB, a metal construction factory, the main activity was in producing water heaters and boilers. The Ctc founder, Gunnar Tillander, had already shown an interest to the factories in Ljungby, but the move was not made until after his death in 1930. Gunnar died only 54 years old, thus he never lived to see Ctc's great rise during the 30s and 40s. The production in Ljungby started on January 1st in 1931. This photograph shows the entire Ctc workforce, with factory manager Andrén on the far right. There were only 12 men working for Ctc at the start. We can tell that Ctc was a good employer and a safe workplace, since 7 of the original 12 still worked at Ctc in 1960. The first factory on Fogdegatan had an original area of 1,000 square meters, but was expanded as soon as in 1935 with 2 wings, and in 1946 it was 10 times as big, with an area of 10,000 square meters. But it was not until 1960, when the new Ctc factory on Industrigatan was ready, that the entire production was moved to Ljungby. The head office was however left in Gothenburg until the 1970s. The 30s meant expansion for Ctc. The innovative constructions of heaters and boilers, along with an increase in the building of new homes, meant that 8 years later Ctc had a workforce of 175 men, 13 times the original force. World War II broke out in 1939 and Ctc's expansion was put to a halt due to a lack of material. During the war, the factory was partly modified to build producer gas units to the war industry, a rather similar produce to what they already made. Before the war, there were detailed plans on how to expand the factory, but none of them could be realized. The expansion couldn't be reality until the war was over in 1945. Foundry, steelworks, storage, tool department and offices were built. Ctc became an important employer in Ljungby. The Ljungby Railroad was soon equipped with rails going direct to the Ctc factory. The products were loaded directly onto the trains and shipped out to Sweden and Europe. The casing to the hot water accumulators were all made in the Ctc carpentry workshop. A wooden panel casing was standard up until the 1980s. Valves and fittings were Tillander's big interest in the 1920s. And many patents were to be of great importance for the broad range of heating systems that Ctc offers. Huge heat accumulators were manufactured in the need of great amounts of warm water. The casings were hammered into shape. Pressing was never an option. A solderless coupling system for copper pipes revolutionized the installation technique. The system was invented by Ctc and was launched under the name Securix. Today the system is referred to as compression fittings. The Ctc Securix system was improved over time, and it was an important part of Ctc's catalogue long into the 50s. Materials were melted and worked in the factory on Fogdegatan, and then shipped to Gothenburg for assembling. Another 1920s Ctc speciality was the manufacturing of sanitary ware. It was mostly toilet seats and sinks, but Ctc offered the novelty of a complete system with valves, mixers and other accessories included. The radiator valve system Exakt-ventilen, or the precise valve, was another revolutionizing invention, and together with the new Ctc thermostat for apartments, they put the company in the innovative lead and made individual heat measuring possible. The system was praised by IVA, the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. The 40s and 50s were a time of great expansion for Ctc. The washing machine manufacturers Corona and Domus were acquired and became the foundation of the Ctc washing machine production. The collaboration with Ljungby municipality is very successful. Ctc has also provided a very good employee care from the start. A Ctc outdoor area was established in Näglinge near Lake Sjösen with several cabins. this was the perfect place for the employees to spend their vacation and weekends for a cheap sum. During the 50s, Ctc has production on several locations in Sweden. The old company Coronaverken becomes a concern company where Ctc is the biggest unit. In the late 50s, Ctc had outgrown their factory on Fogdegatan, and the new factory in the industrial area is inaugurated in 1960. However, some production still remained in the old factory. Ctc's products are big on the European market, especially in Germany. At one point, Ctc has 5 subsidiary companies in Germany. The washing machine manufacturing is coordinated and grouped under the name Vaskator, and it later becomes the name of the company Vaskator AB. Ctc produces washing machines in Ronneby, and in 1974, the biggest washing machine then in the world is manufactured. In 1972, Ctc constructs a new factory on the Beltway with the intention to move all production there. But the washing machine production is sold to Electrolux in 1973. The company is now known as Electrolux Laundry Systems. The washing machine production of Ctc has thus come to an end. During the 1960s, Coronaverken's activity grows like a weed. They even have an airplane on the Feringe airport. Many companies are acquired, and at the most, 3,000 people work in the business concern. Many of them work in Ljungby. But due to bad times and an overly optimistic expansion, the concern finds itself in an acute crisis in the 70s, which leads to the Corona affair that spreads across the tabloids once Corona is listed on the Swedish stock exchange. After many turns and fights between Wallenberg's Incentive and the AGA concern, the Ctc Group is sold to AGA. Ctc was then promised a new factory since the old one was growing small. The building of the new factory commenced in 1976 and was ready in 1977. The 20,000 square meter factory is still used today. These years are very important for Ctc on the European market, especially in Germany, where several subsidiary companies are spread throughout the country. The German company Kleve GmbH was acquired in the 70s when massive oil-fired boilers were produced. In 1980, 55,000 boilers were manufactured in the current factory. The 70s also came with a big inflation and a general price freeze almost toppled Ctc. Luckily, thanks to intense lobbying, some exceptions to the freeze could be made. In the 80s, everything changed for the heating industry. The decade before had meant energy crisis and oil embargo for Sweden and Europe. This came with great consequences for Ctc. The production of traditional oil boilers decreased in favour for electrical boilers. New-built houses became a lot more efficient during the 80s, and the novelty heat pump became fashionable. Ctc invested large in developing air recovery heat pumps for newly built houses, and throughout the years 75,000 Ctc Master exhaust air pumps were installed in Swedish houses. Oil heating was still the most common form of heating far in through the 80s, but halfway through the decade the oil price culminated. The first Ctc air/water heat pump Rebel was developed and sold for a few years. Even though Ctc was strong both on the German and Swiss market, the sales from the 70s would never be reached again. the boiler production was shut down in the 80s as well. The Ctc system was taken back into use, namely to produce warm water when needed. Now it was used with effective plate heat exchanger. AGA refined their practice and sold the entire Ctc group to Saab Scania. Saab Scania already possessed a technical group, Combitech AB, so the new heat division was therefore called Enertech. Saab also owned Parca Norrahammar and Bentone Electro Oil. These companies became Ctc's sister companies and were also a part of the new division. This started a tug of war between Parca and Ctc, and for a long time it looked like a move to Norrahammar and Jönköping would be reality. But the entire division was sold in '88, out of the blue, to the Trelleborg Group, and therefore the entire production was moved to Ljungby instead. This is how close it was that the venerable Ctc didn't stay in Ljungby. The Enertech Group was in Trelleborg AB's hand for 5 years. It was all sold to an English concern in 1993, Wolseley Limited. Wolseley was a huge concern, first and foremost active in wholesale, with amongst other things heating and sanitation in their production. The 90s were the oil boiler's renaissance. The oil was cheap again, and the many installations of oil-fired boilers in Swedish homes forced the government to favour electric boilers and heat pumps. The big heat pump breakthrough came in the late 90s with, above all, the downhole heat exchanger and the geothermal heat pump. Sales were rising fast and steady, and during the early 2000s records were broken year after year. Ctc re-entered the market in 1998 with its first geothermal heat pump, Ctc EcoHeat, in 4 different effect sizes. But it was the air/water heat pumps that took Ctc to success. The launching of Eco Air in 2001 lifted the entire air/water market, and Ctc would take almost 50% of that market. That same year, 2001, the Enertech Group was sold once again. Wolseley had tried to sell it off for a few years, and it was bought by the current owner, Mr. Roger Hancox. There has been a complete readjustment under Mr. Hancox's lead, from a traditional welding of boilers to a modern heat pump factory. New EU efficiency standards and climate goals, favouring renewable fuels, have made the Ctc production development to target heat pumps and solid fuel boilers. Fossil-fired boilers are decreasing in numbers, and the ones produced in the factory are of a modern condensing type. Regular oil boilers and double boilers all belong in the past. Today's products are highly efficient to maximize performance and productivity. The latest lambda-controlled wood-fired boilers are already performing to the toughest European climate requirements of 2017. With Gunnar Rika Tillander's and Ctc's Latin thesis, with the temptation to change, we can see a constantly changing market and a changing world with sought-after products. We are looking forward to the 100th anniversary.